He was invisible to the world, until two dying puppies cried out in the night, a broken man, a cruel past, and a choice that would change everything. Would you risk everything to save them? Stay until the end, because what happens next will break your heart, and maybe heal it too. The town of Millstone had always worn a coat of melancholy, but now, in the sharp breath of late autumn, it seemed to shrink even further into itself. The sky hung low and heavy, a deep iron gray, while a biting drizzle whispered through the leafless trees and pattered against cracked sidewalks. Streetlights flickered half-heartedly along Main Street, casting more shadows than light. In the colder pockets of town, like the aging neighborhood Elias Quinn called home, the gloom felt almost personal. Elias Quinn was a man made small by life. At 45, he looked older, worn down by the slow grind of years spent unseen and unloved. His body was slight, with narrow shoulders and a stooped frame that seemed to carry invisible burdens. His hair was the color of faded coal, thinning at the crown, and often hung in messy clumps across his forehead. His skin was pale, freckled with small scars from work accidents he never spoke of. His clothes, oversized wool coats, frayed jeans, boots scuffed raw, were more armor than attire. Those who passed him rarely remembered his face. Fewer still remembered his name. Elias lived alone in a sagging two-room house at the edge of Millstone. His only companions were the whispers of wind against the windows and the moan of the floorboards under his cautious steps. It had always been easier to avoid people, easier to let them forget him than risk the slow, suffocating disappointment that had followed every attempt at connection. Even as a boy, Elias had been the target of whispered jokes, of dares and cruel games. Somewhere along the way, he had decided that wanting anything more than survival was a fool's dream. That night, trudging home after another long shift at the warehouse, Elias kept his head down against the fine, needling rain. It was only by chance, a brief pause as he adjusted the sagging strap of his worn backpack, that he heard it, a faint, desperate sound, almost too soft to be real. A whimper maybe, a cry that didn't belong to the wind. He froze. The sound came again, more insistent this time, and Elias turned toward it, his heart picking up a nervous rhythm. Across the empty lot, behind the broken chain-link fence that marked the boundary of Lester Kane's property, something moved beneath a sagging tarp. Lester Kane was a man built of anger and beer. In his late 50s, his heavy-set frame had once carried muscle, but time and bitterness had swollen him into a mass of bloat and bluster. His face was a permanent scowl, his small eyes set deep beneath a heavy brow, and a thick neck that turned red with even the smallest provocation. Since his wife Marlene had left him a year ago, Lester had slid further into decay, both of house and of soul. Marlene had been one of the few bright lights in Millstone, a tall, slender woman with a ready laugh and a fierce kindness that had once made their little house on the corner feel almost welcoming. But kindness was no match for Lester's growing violence, and one day, without fanfare, she packed her things and vanished. She had left behind her beloved golden retriever, Honey, and, by cruel extension, the two puppies Honey had birthed not long after. Honey, a dog whose golden fur once seemed spun from sunlight, had wasted away under Lester's drunken neglect. She had roamed the fenced-in yard, searching for scraps, shrinking day by day until finally, the cold and the hunger and the beatings claimed her. Her body still lay in the far corner of the yard, a shadow under the withered apple tree, as if even death had not freed her from the place. The puppies, Elias realized now, his throat tightening, had been left to fend for themselves. He edged closer, staying within the embrace of a gnarled oak, and peered through the rusted fence. Beneath the shredded tarp, he saw them. Two tiny figures, curled together in a shallow nest of mud and broken leaves. Their golden fur was matted with grime, their limbs painfully thin, ribs pressing against fragile skin. One of them whimpered again, a thin, wavering sound that clawed at Elias's heart. The other barely stirred, its small body trembling with each labored breath. For a long moment, Elias could do nothing but stand there, clutching the fence with white-knuckled hands, his breath misting in the cold air. He knew he should walk away. This was none of his business. He had spent a lifetime convincing himself that getting involved only led to pain. And yet, something inside him, something fragile and stubborn, refused to turn away. He thought of Honey, the loyal creature who had once been seen trotting happily down Main Street beside Marlene, her tail wagging like a living flag of hope. He thought of Marlene's soft voice cooing to her dog, the way the whole town had smiled at the sight of them. And then he thought of Lester, of the bruises blooming like dark flowers across Honey's flank, of the empty yard where Joy had once lived. The rain picked up, stinging Elias's cheeks like tiny slaps. He pressed his forehead briefly against the cold metal of the fence. His heart ached, a slow, twisting pain that made his chest feel too small. Under the tarp, one of the puppies tried to burrow closer to its sibling, seeking warmth that neither had to give. Elias watched as the smaller of the two lifted its head, just for a moment, and blinked bleary eyes into the gloom. It was too much. He didn't know what he would do yet. He had no plan, no grand gesture waiting in the wings. But as he turned and hurried home through the deepening rain, Elias knew one thing with certainty. He could not, would not, leave them to die. Not this time. The drizzle had thickened into a sullen, steady rain, drumming lightly on the sagging rooftops of Millstone, as Elias Quinn stood frozen behind the gnarled oak tree. The cold bit through the thin fabric of his jacket, seeping into his bones, but he barely noticed. All his senses were attuned to the scene unfolding beyond the battered chain-link fence. Under the weak yellow glow of the single porch light, Lester Kane emerged from the house, his hulking figure a lurching shadow against the misty backdrop. He wore a threadbare plaid shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal thick, scarred forearms, and greasy jeans that clung awkwardly to his bloated frame. His boots squelched in the muddy yard as he stomped toward the tarp where the puppies shivered. In one hand, he carried a dented metal bucket from which he sloshed a handful of filthy water onto the ground, muttering curses under his breath. Lester's face, once broad and perhaps even handsome in a rough-hewn way, had sagged into permanent scorn. His jowls quivered when he spoke, and his narrow eyes gleamed with the kind of malice that bred itself in loneliness and liquor. Bitterness radiated from him in palpable waves, an invisible force that made the air heavier wherever he moved. The larger of the two puppies, the one who had lifted its head earlier, whimpered softly again. Its body jerked reflexively as Lester approached. Without warning, Lester reared back and drove the toe of his heavy boot into the puppy's frail ribs. The sound was dull and sickening, a muffled thud followed by a pained yelp that cut through the drizzle like a blade. Elias recoiled instinctively, his stomach twisting into a tight, painful knot. His back pressed harder against the rough bark of the oak tree as he fought the urge to cry out, to rush forward, to do something, anything. But fear clamped down on him like iron chains. His heart hammered against his ribcage, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Lester grunted, satisfied, and stumbled back toward the house, leaving the tarp flapping uselessly in the wind. The puppies lay motionless, the injured one twitching weakly, its cries reduced to soft, broken whimpers. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to forget what he had seen. But the images seared themselves into his mind, vivid and merciless. Memories long buried under years of cautious isolation clawed their way to the surface, dragging him back into the shadows of his own broken past. He remembered standing on the cracked asphalt of the schoolyard, a skinny boy in two large hand-me-down clothes, while the older boys formed a loose, laughing circle around him. He remembered the shove that sent him sprawling into the gravel, the jeering voices, the way no teacher had noticed, or cared. He remembered the hollow, gnawing sensation of realizing that weakness was a kind of sin, one that others punished without mercy. Later, as a teenager, he had dared to hope that things might change. He had fallen, foolishly, for a girl named Grace Harmon, a bright-eyed, freckle-faced dreamer who smelled of lilacs and fresh-baked bread. For a few stolen months, he had believed he was seen, truly seen, and accepted. But eventually, Grace's smiles grew strained, her words hesitant, until one rainy afternoon she had confessed, haltingly, awkwardly, that she needed someone stronger, someone who could stand up for her. The final look she gave him, full of pity more than regret, had been a wound deeper than any blow. Since then, Elias had carefully constructed a life without attachments, a fortress of solitude built from quiet jobs, empty rooms, and muted days. Wanting was dangerous. Needing was fatal. And yet, here he was, heart aching, body trembling, because two helpless creatures were being crushed beneath the same cruelty he had fled his entire life. The rain thickened into a cold mist that blurred the edges of the world. Elias remained hidden, his fists clenched at his sides, the rough bark of the tree digging into his back. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to act, to burst through the fence and gather those broken bodies into his arms. But he stayed rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear, not just of Lester, but of failing, of making things worse, of opening himself to a pain he might not survive. From the house, the sound of Lester's gruff voice drifted out, a low, angry muttering punctuated by the slam of a door. The porch light flickered and went out, plunging the yard into shadow. Elias dared to exhale, his breath forming a misty plume in the frigid air. He forced himself to turn away, to stumble back across the empty lot, toward his own crumbling house. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if he were dragging the weight of his own cowardice behind him. Inside, the house was cold and dark. The ancient radiator clanked to life with a reluctant shudder as Elias dropped his backpack by the door and sagged onto the threadbare couch. He sat in silence, soaked through, his fingers curled into the damp fabric of his sleeves. In the dimness, the memories continued to swirl, relentless and sharp. The laughter of bullies, the tearful confessions of girls who wanted more, the disdain of neighbors who turned their backs. And now, layered atop it all, the image of two tiny bodies, fragile and broken, left to die beneath a battered tarp. He stared at the cracked ceiling, listening to the rain drumming steadily against the window panes. Something had to change. He couldn't keep pretending he didn't care. Couldn't keep hiding from a world that had already taken so much from him. Somewhere, deep beneath the fear and the sorrow, a small ember flared to life. It was weak, sputtering, but it was there. A flicker of resolve he hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would go back. He didn't know what he would do. He had no plan, no strength, no allies. But he would not turn away again. Not this time. The rain had persisted into the early hours of morning, soaking Millstone in a curtain of gray that seemed to blur the very edges of reality. The cracked sidewalks gleamed like wet glass, and the few cars that rumbled through the sleeping town left shimmering trails behind them. In his small, sagging house on the edge of town, Elias Quinn sat hunched over the battered kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee trembling in his hand. The images from the night before looped endlessly behind his eyes. The fragile bodies beneath the tarp, Lester's boot lashing out, the broken whimpers carried on the wind. Elias hadn't slept. He hadn't even tried. Sleep felt like a betrayal when two tiny lives hung by a thread. He stared at the cracked vinyl tabletop, jaw working as if grinding invisible stones. Fear gnawed at him, cold and sharp, warning him of the dangers that would come if he interfered. Lester Kane was not a man to forgive trespasses, and Elias was no hero. He was a man who had spent his life ducking under the blows of others, mastering the art of making himself small and forgettable. But something was different this time. The thought of those puppies, left to shiver and starve, gnawed at a place inside him that fear couldn't reach. It was the same place, he realized, that had once longed to be chosen, to be wanted, not just tolerated. Somewhere deep in that hollow space, a flicker of something new, or perhaps something very old, was stirring. He rose stiffly from the table, his joints creaking in protest, and moved to the hall closet. The door stuck at first, swollen from years of damp, but he yanked it open with a grunt. Inside, relics of a life spent not living. An old denim jacket, patched and threadbare, a pair of cracked rubber boots, a cardboard box filled with odds and ends he hadn't touched in years. Elias rummaged through the box, pulling free a moth-eaten wool blanket, a battered shoebox, and, near the bottom, a dusty, unopened can of condensed milk. His heart thudded faster. This was ridiculous. Pitiful, even. He didn't know the first thing about caring for puppies. He could barely take care of himself. But he kept gathering. The shoebox, once belonging to a long-forgotten pair of work boots, would have to do as a makeshift cradle. He lined it with the worn blanket, tucking the edges to create a semblance of warmth. The jacket he shrugged over his narrow shoulders, the hem brushing the tops of his worn jeans. The boots, too large and cracking at the seams, he pulled on with a grimace. In the tiny kitchen, he wiped dust off an ancient stovetop kettle and filled it with water. It took several minutes of coaxing the stubborn pilot light before the flames sputtered to life under the battered kettle. He set the unopened can of condensed milk beside it, calculating vaguely how he would need to dilute it. He had no idea if it was still good. The expiration date had worn off years ago. The house smelled faintly of mildew and rusted metal, and the stove's weak heat barely cut through the cold seeping from the thin walls. Elias didn't notice. His hands moved automatically, clumsy but determined. In the corner of the living room sat a cast-iron wood stove, a relic from the house's better days. He crouched beside it, arranging a pile of kindling from the cracked crate he kept under the stairs. With a few false starts, he managed to coax a sputtering flame to life. As the fire caught and grew, a feeble warmth began to push back against the chill. He stood there for a moment, watching the small fire dance behind the sooty glass, and tried to imagine the puppies curled up beside it, safe and warm. The thought made his throat ache. Across the street, a pair of headlights slashed briefly through the gloom, and Elias flinched instinctively, heart hammering. But it was just Mr. Henley, the elderly grocer, returning from an early morning delivery run. Mr. Henley, a stooped, wiry man with a permanent scowl etched into his wrinkled face, had been a fixture of Millstone longer than most of its residents. His gruff demeanor hid a surprising kindness. He was known to slip day-old bread into the bags of struggling customers without charging them, but he demanded silence and loyalty in return. Elias had always respected Mr. Henley's quiet strength, but he knew better than to expect help from anyone in Millstone, not with Lester Kane involved. Still, a small voice inside him wondered if he could save the puppies, even just them. Maybe it would mean something. Maybe it would mean he wasn't the coward the world had always seen. He moved quickly then, gathering the shoebox cradle, tucking the can of milk into his jacket pocket, and wrapping the blanket tight under one arm. He didn't have a proper plan yet, but he knew he needed to act soon. The rain had lessened to a persistent mist, but the cold was sharper now, promising frost before nightfall. In the back of his mind, the old fears whispered still. Lester will find you, hurt you, make you regret this. But Elias clenched his jaw and pushed the thoughts away. For once, he would not listen to them. The fire crackled behind him, casting long shadows across the threadbare furniture as he opened the front door and stepped out into the morning gloom. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to retreat into the familiar numbness of survival. But he didn't. The puppies were waiting. And this time, Elias Quinn was going to be someone they could count on. The rain had thickened into a near-solid curtain by nightfall, lashing sideways across the empty streets of Millstone. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the loose shutters and whistling through the broken eaves of abandoned houses. Pools of water collected along the gutters, reflecting the ghostly flickering glow of the few remaining streetlights. It was a night that warned men to stay indoors, to huddle by their fires and bar their doors against the weight of the world. But Elias Quinn did not stay indoors. Bundled in his threadbare denim jacket, the worn shoebox cradled under one arm, he moved like a shadow along the edges of the neighborhood. His heart thudded against his ribs with a frantic staccato rhythm, and every step felt like it might betray him to the empty, watching windows. He kept his head low, his body hunched against the cold, fat droplets that soaked his jeans and plastered his hair to his forehead. Crossing the muddy lot behind his house, Elias made his way toward the fence that marked the back boundary of Lester Kane's property. The chain link sagged in places, heavy with rust, but it still stood higher than Elias's head. He approached cautiously, scanning the yard beyond for any sign of movement. The house was dark except for a single dim bulb over the back porch, casting a greasy, uncertain light onto the cracked cement steps. No sound came from within. Lester, it seemed, had either passed out in a drunken stupor or found some other misery to sink into for the evening. Steeling himself, Elias crouched low and pushed through a gap in the fence where the links had been pried apart years ago. His jacket snagged on the sharp metal, tearing a shallow scratch across his side, but he hardly noticed. His breath misted in the frigid air, and every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run home and forget this madness. Instead, he pressed on, boots squelching softly in the sucking mud. The tarp still lay where he had last seen it, pinned beneath a broken cinder block, sagging under the relentless weight of the rain. Beneath it, two small forms huddled together, barely visible in the gloom. Elias's heart twisted painfully at the sight. The larger puppy, the one with a faint stripe of lighter gold down its spine, lifted its head feebly at his approach, a small, broken whimper escaping its cracked lips. Its sibling remained curled tightly against it, unmoving except for the faint shudder of its breathing. Elias knelt slowly, every movement deliberate, every nerve taut with fear. He peeled back the sodden tarp with trembling hands, wincing at the smell of wet fur and sickness that rose to meet him. The puppy's eyes blinked up at him, dazed and uncomprehending. He reached out, hesitated, then gently slid his hands beneath their frail bodies. They were lighter than he had feared, terrifyingly light, as if they might simply blow away with the next gust of wind. As he lifted them, one in each arm, they whimpered softly, but did not struggle. Their trust, or perhaps their exhaustion, was complete. Elias tucked them carefully inside his jacket, cradling them against his chest, where the weak heat of his body might offer some meager comfort. The shoebox, forgotten in the mud, was far too small and too fragile for this rescue. The puppies shivered against him, tiny hearts fluttering rapidly against his ribs. Elias rose to his feet, swaying slightly under the combined weight of terror and responsibility. He glanced once toward the dark house. No movement, no shout of rage, only the relentless hammer of rain. He turned and retraced his steps toward the fence, moving as quickly and quietly as the slippery ground would allow. His boots sank into the muck, sucking greedily at his ankles, but he pulled free each time, driven by a desperate urgency he barely recognized. The puppies made no sound beyond the occasional soft whine, their bodies pressing closer to the warmth of his chest. Elias tightened his grip, feeling an odd, fierce protectiveness rise within him. Halfway across the lot, a sudden movement to his left made him freeze, his heart leaping into his throat. A shadow shifted behind the crooked silhouette of an abandoned garden shed. For one terrible moment, Elias imagined Lester barreling toward him, fists raised, voice booming curses into the night. But it was only a stray cat, thin and wild-eyed, darting across the mud in search of shelter. Its fur hung in clumps, and its tail was a whip of bone and wet fur. Elias watched it vanish into the darkness, a pang of sympathy tightening his chest. Millstone had too many abandoned creatures these days. He pressed on, finally reaching the broken gap in the fence. With great care, he maneuvered through, shielding the puppies with his body from the jagged metal. The cold sliced through him anew once he was out in the open, but he hardly noticed. By the time he reached his own back door, his hands were numb, and the puppies had gone limp with exhaustion. He fumbled with the lock, cursing softly under his breath, before finally wrestling it open and stumbling inside. The warmth from the wood stove hit him like a wall, startling in its suddenness. The fire he had stoked earlier had grown strong, filling the small living room with a cozy golden glow. Shadows danced along the battered walls, lending the place an almost magical air. Elias dropped to his knees beside the stove, easing the puppies out of his jacket with infinite gentleness. He wrapped them carefully in the moth-eaten blanket, layering them close to the hearth where the heat would be strongest. They whimpered once, twice, then settled into a trembling stillness, their tiny bodies visibly relaxing under the blanket's weight. For a long moment, Elias simply sat there, watching them, his heart thudding painfully against his ribs. His hands shook, not from cold now, but from the enormity of what he had done. He had stolen them. He had made himself a target for Lester's rage. But for the first time in his memory, he felt needed, wanted. Not as a burden or a joke, but as a protector. The puppies needed him, and he would not fail them. Not this time.
The door creaked shut behind him, and for a moment the house stood frozen in a heavy silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the wood stove and the soft, ragged breathing of the puppies in Elias's arms. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind battering the windows with fists of rain. But within the battered walls of Elias's home, a fragile bubble of warmth and determination had formed, a world apart from the cruelty he had left behind. The puppies stirred against him, their small bodies shivering uncontrollably. Elias knelt before the stove, easing them gently onto the moth-eaten blanket he had placed earlier by the hearth. Their fur was soaked and filthy, clinging to their skeletal frames, and their breathing was shallow, rattling in their tiny chests. Panic fluttered in Elias's chest. He had no idea what he was doing. His experience with living creatures extended no further than keeping a few stubborn houseplants alive, and even that was a stretch. But he couldn't just sit there and watch them fade away. He stripped off his wet jacket, the denim stiff and heavy with rain, and wrapped it around the puppies, tucking them closer to the heat. Then, almost on instinct, he lay down beside them, curling his thin frame around their tiny bodies. His clothes were damp and smelled faintly of mildew, but he didn't care. He needed to share whatever warmth he had, however meager it might be. As he pressed them closer to him, he felt their small hearts hammering frantically, weak and fast. He began to murmur soft nonsense into the damp fur, words without meaning, but heavy with emotion. His voice, rough from disuse, cracked over whispered apologies. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Above them, the fire popped and sighed, throwing shifting shadows across the faded wallpaper and cracked ceiling. The puppies whimpered weakly, but they nestled closer into Elias's chest, seeking the fragile shelter of his body. The minutes dragged by, stretching into aching eternities. Elias barely moved, barely breathed, as he willed his body heat into the tiny creatures. He was dimly aware of the bruises forming on his knees from the hard wooden floor, the chill seeping up from the cracked foundation, but none of it mattered. Only the shallow rise and fall of the puppies' chests mattered. Time slipped away, measured only by the slow, painful calming of the trembling bodies against him. At some point, he heard a car engine sputter to life down the street, the drunk roar of an old pickup truck fighting the storm. Elias stiffened, his heart jerking into his throat. Lester. From behind the shelter of the blanket and his own body, Elias strained his ears, catching the distant, muffled sound of tires spinning in the mud. Then, fading into the distance, the engine growled its way down the road, swallowed by the storm. He exhaled slowly. Muscles he hadn't realized were clenched, beginning to loosen. Lester, it seemed, was too drunk, too lost in his own bitterness to notice that anything had changed. The thought didn't comfort Elias. If anything, it made him ache all the more for the tiny lives he had stolen away from that nightmare. The larger puppy, he could see now it was slightly bigger, its coat a richer gold despite the grime, twitched its nose against Elias's chest. The smaller one, thinner and with a faint patch of white on its forehead, gave a feeble sigh and pressed deeper into the crook of Elias's arm. Their trust was complete, undeserved perhaps, but total. A lump rose in Elias's throat. No one had ever needed him like this, not even when he had been a boy himself, hoping for someone to notice, someone to save him. No one had. He had learned early that the world was not kind to those who waited. But these two, broken and shivering, had no one else. He shifted carefully, freeing one hand to reach for the can of condensed milk he had set near the stove. With trembling fingers, he pried it open, the metal groaning in protest, and poured a thick stream into an old mug. He thinned it with warm water from the kettle, swirling it awkwardly until it looked about right. He didn't have a bottle or a proper feeder, only a small battered spoon. He dipped it into the mug and carefully brought it to the puppies' mouths. The larger one responded first, lapping weakly at the spoonful of milk. Encouraged, Elias coaxed it to drink a little more. The smaller one took longer, its tiny body barely responsive, but after a few moments, it too sucked at the edge of the spoon, drawing in precious sustenance with slow, desperate sips. Tears blurred Elias's vision. He blinked them away furiously. "You're not gonna die here," he muttered hoarsely, more to himself than to them. "Not while I'm breathing." He fed them as much as they could manage, little by little, then tucked them back under the blanket, closer than before. They curled into the hollow of his chest and stomach, and gradually their shivering eased, their breathing deepened. Outside, the storm began to abate, the furious howling of the wind softening into a mournful sigh. In the dim light of the dying fire, the house seemed less oppressive, more a refuge than a prison. Elias closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him from all sides, but he didn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the steady, fragile heartbeats pressed against him, and for the first time in a long, long while, he dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, he could be enough, not perfect, not strong, but enough, and for these two broken little souls, that would have to be enough. Morning crept into Millstone with a sullen grayness, the sky still heavy with rain clouds, the streets slick and empty. Inside the sagging frame of Elias Quinn's house, time had taken on a strange, fragile quality, measured only by the shallow breaths of the two tiny creatures he had risked everything to save. The larger puppy, the one with the richer golden coat, slept fitfully beside the fire, wrapped snugly in the moth-eaten blanket. But the smaller one, the fragile soul with the faint white mark on its forehead, struggled. Its tiny body burned with fever, trembling uncontrollably despite the warmth of the fire and Elias's desperate care. Elias knelt by the hearth, the rough wooden floor biting into his knees, his hands clumsy and trembling as he soaked a rag in cool water and dabbed it gently against the puppy's forehead. His movements were awkward, uncertain, but each one was infused with a fierce, single-minded tenderness. His heart hammered painfully against his ribs, each shallow breath from the puppy a battle he fought alongside it. The little creature's nose was dry and cracked, its breathing ragged, tiny ribs heaving with effort. More than once, Elias had to turn away, blinking back tears he couldn't afford to shed. He whispered broken promises into the warm, heavy air, promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "You stay with me," he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion and fear. "You stay." The fire in the old cast-iron stove cast long, flickering shadows across the room. It was a fragile warmth, barely enough to hold back the damp cold that seeped through the thin walls. Elias fed it with everything he had: splintered chair legs, scraps of old crates, even the framed photographs that had hung, dusty and forgotten, in the hallway. Nothing was too precious now. The blanket that cradled the puppies had once been Elias's most treasured possession, a gift from his mother, long before life had taught him how easily love could be lost. Woven from thick, scratchy wool in fading blues and grays, it still carried the faint scent of lavender from the cedar chest where it had been kept for years. Elias had slept under it through countless lonely winters, a meager barrier against the cold, both outside and within. And yet, without hesitation, he had folded it around the tiny bodies now fighting for their lives, choosing their warmth over his own. In a corner of the room, on a battered armchair whose stuffing poked out from ripped seams, sat an old, stuffed rabbit. Threadbare, one button eye missing, a relic of a boyhood that had never known much comfort. Once, that rabbit had been Elias's only companion, cradled in small arms through long, frightened nights. Now he understood what that small, desperate need to protect had meant. As the day dragged on, the fever in the smaller puppy worsened. Its cries grew weaker, more pitiful. It refused the spoonfuls of milk Elias offered, its tiny body curling in on itself as if trying to hide from the world. Desperation clawed at Elias. He wrapped the puppy closer against his chest, letting his own body heat soak into it, rocking gently as he hummed tunelessly under his breath. The sound, rough and low, filled the empty spaces of the room, wrapping around them like a second blanket. Outside, the rain began to ease, tapering to a soft, persistent drizzle. Through the grimy windows, the world remained cloaked in gray, the trees skeletal against the sky. Afternoon faded into evening without Elias moving from his spot by the fire. He fed the larger puppy as best he could, coaxing it to lap at the diluted milk, wiping its muzzle with tender care. The stronger pup's eyes began to lose their glazed look, flickering with brief moments of awareness. But Elias's heart remained anchored to the frailer one, watching every twitch, every breath with a vigilance that bordered on prayer. At some point, a knock sounded faintly at the front door, a quick, perfunctory rap, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. Elias didn't move. Later, when he finally checked, he would find a dented box of canned food and a faded note in neat, slanted handwriting. From Mr. Henley, stay warm. The old grocer, gruff and stooped, had a way of noticing things without ever admitting he noticed them. Elias would have to thank him someday, though he had no idea how. But for now, there was only the fire, the two tiny lives, and the ache of hope and fear tangled together in his chest. As night fell, Elias huddled closer to the stove, wrapping his body around the puppies like a human shield against the dark. The larger one snored softly, a faint, whistling sound that tugged a smile from Elias despite the exhaustion dragging at his bones. The smaller one, for the first time in hours, let out a breath that wasn't a gasp. It was a soft, shuddery sigh, barely a whisper of sound, but it was enough. Elias closed his eyes, his forehead resting against the curve of the puppy's tiny back, and let out a long, ragged breath of his own. They weren't out of danger yet, not by a long shot, but they were still fighting. And so was he. Outside, the rain finally stopped. The wind died down to a gentle murmuring breeze that rattled the loose shutters in a kind of tentative lullaby. The fire in the stove crackled and popped, its light playing over the battered furniture, the ragged curtains, the tired man, and the two broken souls he had pulled from the edge of despair. For the first time in years, Elias Quinn didn't feel alone. The cold had begun to lift, giving way to a brittle, watery sunshine that spilled across the cracked sidewalks and sagging rooftops of Millstone. Patches of ice glittered in the morning light like broken glass, and the air smelled of wet asphalt and thawing earth. Elias Quinn hunched low over a battered old shopping cart, the wheels squeaking and wobbling with every jolt over the uneven pavement. Inside the cart, tucked carefully between layers of threadbare towels and the worn wool blanket, lay the two puppies. They slept in fitful bursts, their thin bodies still weak but no longer trembling with fever. Elias pushed the cart slowly, casting wary glances over his shoulder with every few steps. He didn't want to draw attention. He couldn't afford it. The town's only veterinary clinic was a modest building tucked between a shuttered laundromat and an aging gas station at the edge of Main Street. It had once been a bustling place, but, like so much of Millstone, it had faded with time, its paint peeling and its sign hanging crooked from rusted chains. Elias pressed onward, heart pounding, as if every creak of the cart might summon Lester Kane from the shadows. It was as he was struggling up the final slope to the clinic's parking lot that Harper Collins first saw him. Harper, at 26, carried the air of someone perpetually caught between urgency and curiosity. She was of average height, her figure slim but sturdy, built for movement rather than grace. Her hair, a mess of chestnut curls, was hastily pulled into a loose ponytail, and a pair of square-framed glasses perched low on her nose. She wore an old, army green jacket 2 sizes too big, scuffed jeans, and heavy boots still dusted with the remnants of mud from her early morning rounds. Harper had moved to Millstone less than a year ago, trading the clamor of Chicago for the sleepy hush of small-town reporting. Most days, she covered town council meetings, lost pet notices, and local bake-offs, but she had never stopped looking, hoping for something more meaningful. She was leaning against her dented blue hatchback, scribbling notes into a weather-beaten notebook, when her gaze caught on the sight of Elias. Something about him, the hunched posture, the cautious, almost furtive movements, made her straighten. She watched as he wrestled the cart up the slope, pausing every few steps to adjust the bundle within. Curiosity prickled at the back of her neck. Acting on instinct, Harper tucked her notebook under her arm and approached, boots crunching against the salted pavement. "Need a hand?" she called out, keeping her tone light. Elias jerked upright, startled, his eyes wide with alarm. For a moment he looked ready to flee, one hand tightening protectively over the edge of the cart. Harper slowed her approach, raising both hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy. I'm not here to cause trouble." Up close, she could see the deep lines etched into Elias's face, the way his too-thin frame seemed to shrink beneath his coat. His brown eyes were wary, shuttered, like someone long accustomed to expecting the worst. Her gaze dropped to the contents of the cart, and her breath caught. 2 puppies, filthy and frail, barely more than breathing skeletons wrapped in tattered fabric. One of them stirred weakly, letting out a tiny, broken whine that twisted something deep inside her. The memory slammed into Harper so hard she had to bite her lip to stay grounded. She was 9 years old again, crouched in the backyard of her childhood home in Missouri, cradling the broken body of her dog, Max. Max had been her best friend, her protector until the day he had wandered into the wrong yard and met the wrong kind of man, a man who had thought it amusing to teach a child a lesson about weakness. By the time Harper's parents found them, it had been too late. The grief had hardened into something cold and furious inside her, something that had never truly thawed. It was why she had become a reporter, why she still believed, stubbornly, that sometimes shining a light into dark corners could change things. Harper looked back at Elias, saw the raw fear and battered hope warring across his weathered face, and made a decision. "Where you headed?" she asked, her voice softer now. Elias hesitated as if weighing the cost of trusting her. Then, almost reluctantly, he muttered, "Vet. They need help." His voice was rough, like gravel underfoot, and Harper had to lean closer to catch the words. But she nodded, offering a small, encouraging smile. "I'm Harper," she said, extending her hand. Elias blinked at it for a moment, as if unsure what to do, before giving it a quick, almost fearful shake. His fingers were cold and calloused, the grip tentative. "Elias," he said simply. "Come on," Harper said, jerking her chin toward the clinic. "Let's get them inside. I'll help." Together, they pushed the cart through the cracked glass doors into the dimly lit lobby. The receptionist, an elderly woman named Mrs. Danner, with tight gray curls and a sharp eye, looked up from her romance novel with mild surprise, but said nothing. She had long ago learned that Millstone's oddities were best met with silence and a nod. Harper helped Elias lift the puppies gently from the cart and onto a faded wool blanket in the corner. She watched as Elias hovered, his hands trembling slightly, as if afraid the tiny creatures might vanish if he let go for even a moment. The vet on duty, a thin, stooped man named Dr. Mason, emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on a stained smock. His sharp, bird-like features softened when he saw the puppies, and without a word he knelt to examine them, his hands surprisingly gentle. Harper stayed back, giving Elias space, but keeping him within the protective orbit of her presence. She knew, somehow, that he needed that right now more than anything else. After a few tense minutes, Dr. Mason looked up and gave a small, encouraging nod. "They're in bad shape," he said, "but they've got a fighting chance. You got them out just in time." Elias sagged visibly, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding escaping in a shudder. Harper felt her own chest loosen, a knot she hadn't realized she was carrying beginning to unwind. She met Elias's wary gaze and smiled again, this time with something more solid behind it. "You're not alone in this," she said simply. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias believed her. The wind had calmed, and a cautious sun peeked through the thinning clouds over Millstone. The town's tired streets, usually muted and slow to stir even on the best of mornings, buzzed faintly with a kind of unusual energy. At the heart of it all, unknowingly, sat Elias Quinn, hunched over in his worn armchair by the fire, a blanket draped carefully over his knees and two small golden bodies curled close against his side. The puppies, whom Elias still hadn't dared name, slept soundly, tiny chests rising and falling in tandem, warmed not just by the fire, but by the fragile sanctuary that had been built around them. Elias absently hummed a lullaby his mother used to sing, his voice low and cracked but steady. It was a habit now, one he found himself slipping into whenever the room grew too still. Harper Collins, crouched discreetly near the far corner of the living room, lifted her phone and captured the moment without a sound. In the soft glow of the firelight, with the battered walls and peeling wallpaper forming a humble backdrop, Elias looked both heartbreakingly small and astonishingly large, like a man carrying the weight of a world no one else had seen. The puppies shifted, snuggling closer into the crook of his arm, and Elias instinctively tucked them tighter under the blanket. Harper blinked hard against the sudden sting in her eyes. Later, she would stitch the clips together into a short video. No narration, no dramatics. Just raw, unvarnished truth. A man who had nothing, offering everything he had to creatures smaller and more vulnerable than himself. When she finally posted it that evening, she did so without much hope. Maybe a few dozen people in Millstone would see it. Maybe someone would offer help. She didn't expect the firestorm that followed. The video spread with breathtaking speed. Within hours, shares ticked up into the thousands, comments pouring in from every corner of the country. By midnight, local news outlets had picked it up. By morning, a major network had contacted Harper for permission to air it on their morning segment under the headline, "The Night Watchman and His Two Little Angels." In the video, Elias never looked directly at the camera. He never noticed it was there. He simply existed, as he always had, quiet, overlooked, utterly sincere. And that sincerity struck a chord in people who had long grown weary of cruelty dressed as entertainment. Donations flooded in first. Offers of money, crates of puppy food, blankets, medicine. Messages arrived from as far away as Oregon and Maine. Handwritten letters tucked inside boxes of supplies. Some scrawled in the shaky penmanship of elderly dog lovers, others colorful and exuberant from school children. Elias didn't know what to make of it. When the first knock came, a tentative rap at the door, he almost didn't answer. Fear prickled down his spine, but Harper, ever the calm presence, gave him a reassuring nod from across the room. Opening the door revealed Mrs. Abernathy, a stout woman in her 60s, with silver hair tied into a neat bun and cheeks reddened from the cold. She was a longtime owner of Abernathy's Quilts and Crafts, known in town both for her sharp tongue and her even sharper sewing skills. Mrs. Abernathy thrust a bundle into Elias's hands without preamble, a thick, hand-stitched quilt patterned in deep greens and golds. "Figured you could use something proper to keep those babies warm," she said briskly, her voice gruff but her eyes suspiciously bright. "And yourself, too." Before Elias could stammer out a thank you, she was gone, stomping back down the walkway with military precision. More knocks followed. Mr. Leland, the retired firefighter with a limp from an old accident, dropped off a bag of dog food large enough to feed a small army. His weathered face broke into a rare smile as he ruffled Elias's hair with surprising gentleness. The Peterson twins, no more than 10 years old, brought a box of toys, squeaky bones, soft balls, chewed at the edges but offered with solemn pride. Their mother, a tall, reed-thin woman with worry lines around her mouth, handed over a container of homemade soup, still warm. Even Pastor Reynolds from the First Baptist Church stopped by, leaving behind a small envelope stuffed with donations collected after Sunday service. Elias stood in the middle of his living room, stunned, clutching the quilt to his chest as Harper ticked off items on a growing list. "You're a local hero now," she teased gently, flashing him a grin over the top of her clipboard. Elias shook his head, bewildered. "I didn't do anything," he muttered. "You loved," Harper said simply, "when it was easier not to." By evening, the living room had transformed. Where once there had been only bare floors and broken furniture, now there were stacks of supplies, new bowls for the puppies, clean towels, and jars of homemade dog treats. The fire burned brighter, fueled by donations of wood from neighbors Elias hadn't spoken to in years. The puppies, sensing the shift somehow, grew stronger. The larger one was the first to find its voice, letting out a high, joyous bark that startled Elias so much he nearly dropped his coffee mug. The smaller one followed days later, wobbling toward Elias with tentative steps, tail wagging in uncertain rhythm. They were healing, and so was he. That night, as he sat by the fire, the two little golden bodies pressed warmly against his sides. Elias found himself humming again. Not the sorrowful lullabies of the past, but a new brighter tune he didn't even realize he knew. Outside, Millstone slumbered peacefully, blanketed in a quiet that was no longer so heavy. Inside, under the flickering firelight, a broken man and two broken souls mended one another, stitch by fragile stitch. The days of quiet warmth had lulled Elias Quinn into a fragile kind of peace. For the first time in longer than he could remember, his small home pulsed with life. Clumsy, joyous life that came in the form of two growing puppies who tumbled over each other and chewed on the frayed edges of the old couch. The community's outpouring of love had transformed the barren house into something that almost resembled a home. But peace, as Elias was learning, was a delicate thing. It shattered on a Wednesday afternoon. The sun hung low and hazy in the winter sky, the light muted through a thin veil of mist. Elias had just finished patching a new quilt over the drafty living room window when he heard it. A hard, angry pounding at the door. The kind of knock that didn't ask permission. The puppies, whom Elias had finally shyly named Sparrow and Ash, startled from their nap and huddled against his ankles, whimpering. Heart hammering, Elias wiped his hands on his jeans and moved toward the door, every step weighed down by dread. He didn't have to look through the warped glass to know who it was. Lester Kane. Lester stood hulking on the porch, his bulk framed by the fading gray light. He looked even more monstrous than Elias remembered. His face blotched red with anger, a stained jacket hanging from his thick shoulders, and his fists balled tight at his sides. His eyes, small and mean beneath his heavy brow, glittered with the cold satisfaction of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Open the damn door, Quinn," he barked, slamming his palm against the wood. Elias froze, instinct screaming at him to bolt, to hide, to shrink into the shadows. It was what he had done all his life. But not this time. Behind him, Sparrow gave a soft, uncertain yip. Ash, always the quieter one, pressed closer to his leg. Their trust was a tangible thing, delicate but unbreakable. They needed him, they depended on him, and Elias Quinn would not fail them. He drew in a shaky breath, squared his narrow shoulders, and turned the deadbolt with trembling fingers. The door creaked open a few inches, the chain lock still in place. Lester loomed into view, the sour stink of alcohol and sweat rolling off him in waves. "Give 'em back," Lester growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You stole what's mine." "They're not yours," Elias said, surprised by the firmness of his own voice. His hands shook, but he kept his grip steady on the door. "You abandoned them?" Lester laughed, a brutal, humorless sound. "Doesn't matter. They're mine by law. You got no right." From the corner of the living room, unnoticed, Harper Collins slipped into view. She had been visiting, checking up on Elias and the puppies like she often did now, her presence as constant and comforting as the fire in the hearth. Today, she had brought a new bag of toys, claiming it was an excuse to visit. Now, phone in hand, Harper quietly activated the camera, her expression hardening. Harper had grown up fighting battles she couldn't win, against small-town apathy, against people who thought cruelty was just part of life. She wasn't about to back down now. Lester shifted, noticing movement behind Elias. His lip curled. "Who's this? You calling the damn news on me now?" he sneered. "You're threatening someone in their own home," Harper said calmly, stepping forward into the narrow hallway light. Her voice was steady, authoritative. "You might want to think about what you say next." Lester's gaze flickered to the glowing screen of her phone, recognition dawning. His nostrils flared, and for a moment, Elias thought he might lunge. But then Lester's bravado wavered, the alcohol and arrogance faltering in the face of something he wasn't used to encountering: witnesses. "You think anyone cares what you got?" he spat. "A nobody and some mutts." Elias's hands curled into fists at his sides. Years of swallowed words, of hunched shoulders and averted eyes, burned away in an instant. "They care," Elias said, voice low but unshakable. "They care more than you ever will." Outside, tires crunched on the gravel driveway. A sheriff's cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing silently. Harper's earlier text had been succinct but effective. "Come quick. Threat at Quinn's house." Deputy Marla Sanderson stepped out, a stout, capable woman with dark skin and a steady gaze that had seen far worse than drunken threats. She wore her brown uniform with an easy authority, her badge gleaming against her heavy winter coat. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Marla said, her voice mild but unmistakably firm. "Everything all right here?" Lester stiffened, his mouth working soundlessly for a moment. "He's got my dogs," he blurted finally, jabbing a finger toward Elias. Marla arched an eyebrow. "Dogs that were reported neglected and abandoned on your property? That's funny, because we've got about 200,000 people online who think otherwise." Harper's video had already reached the sheriff's office. The tide was not on Lester's side. "You're drunk, Mr. Kane," Marla continued evenly, "and trespassing. I suggest you turn around and go home before you make things worse for yourself." For a moment, Lester looked ready to argue. His fists flexed at his sides. But then, with a mumbled curse and a dangerous look tossed over his shoulder, he stomped back to his battered pickup and roared off down the street, leaving a trail of exhaust and bitter rage in his wake. Marla waited until his taillights disappeared before turning to Elias. "You all right?" she asked, her voice gentler now. Elias nodded, too overwhelmed for words. "If he shows up again, you call us," Marla said. "We've got enough evidence now. He won't bother you for long." Harper ended the recording on her phone, slipping it into her jacket pocket with a small, satisfied smile. Elias closed the door slowly, the chain still dangling between his fingers. He turned to find Harper watching him, her expression warm, proud. "You did good," she said simply. The puppies, sensing the tension ebbing from the room, trotted toward him with clumsy enthusiasm. Sparrow nipped at his bootlace, tail wagging, while Ash burrowed his small head against Elias's ankle. Elias scooped them up, burying his face in their soft fur, the last of his fear draining away like melting ice. For the first time, Elias Quinn stood tall, not just because he had to, but because he knew he could. And he wasn't alone. The snow returned to Millstone a week later, but it wasn't the heavy, choking kind that blanketed the streets into silence. This time it drifted down like confetti, swirling lazily through the pale winter sky, catching on the cracked sidewalks and the slanted rooftops, turning everything soft and new. Inside the once-forgotten house at the edge of town, Elias Quinn was learning what it meant to rebuild. Not just walls and floors, but a life. It had begun slowly. After Lester Kane's arrest, charged formally with animal cruelty and stripped of any future rights to own animals, there had been a strange, almost giddy ripple through the town. People who had once passed Elias by without a second glance now nodded to him on the streets, sometimes offering shy smiles, sometimes dropping off donations without a word. The first major change came when Mr. Henley, the gruff old grocer, appeared on Elias's doorstep with a team of volunteers, sturdy men in flannel shirts, women in heavy boots with tool belts slung over their hips, ready to help fix the old house. Among them was Rosa Martinez, a broad-shouldered woman with a booming laugh and a heart as wide as the sky. Rosa had run the town's diner for 20 years, and she organized the renovation like she organized her kitchen, briskly, efficiently, and with occasional muttered Spanish that no one dared argue with. Under Rosa's command, broken floorboards were replaced, sagging ceilings reinforced, windows sealed against the cold. The old wood stove was cleaned and polished until it gleamed. A neighbor Elias had barely known, a retired carpenter named Bill Foster, wiry and sun-browned from a life of labor, crafted a new set of sturdy shelves, which Elias filled with donated dog toys, blankets, and cans of food. Throughout it all, Harper Collins was a near-constant presence, her notebook tucked under her arm, camera slung casually around her neck. She documented the transformation not for any official article, but because she understood instinctively that some stories deserved to be remembered even if no one was paying to print them. Harper herself had changed in small, subtle ways. Her briskness softened around Elias. Her quick journalistic curiosity often gave way to quiet companionship. They became friends in the truest, most unexpected sense, bonded not by obligation, but by choice. Harper's background gave her a kind of quiet resilience. She had grown up with a father who was kind but distant, a man who had spent more time fixing old motorcycles in the garage than talking to his daughter. Harper had learned early to be self-sufficient, to rely on herself when the world grew cold. But something about Elias, his shyness, his stubborn kindness, warmed places inside her she hadn't realized were still frozen. The house, once a place of silence and dust, now rang with life. Sparrow and Ash thrived in their new kingdom, growing from fragile, trembling creatures into mischievous whirlwinds of energy. Sparrow, with his sunny coat and boundless enthusiasm, became the ringleader of their adventures, while Ash, smaller and a bit more cautious, was the thoughtful shadow that always stayed close to Elias's side. Elias built them a play area in the backyard, fencing off a patch of half-frozen earth and filling it with chew toys, old tires, and sturdy ramps crafted by Bill Foster's steady hands. Neighbors sometimes stopped by just to watch the puppies tumble through the snow, their joyous barks cutting through the crisp winter air. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in strokes of lavender and gold, Elias stood in the doorway, a mug of coffee warm in his hands, and watched Sparrow and Ash wrestle in the fresh snow. Harper leaned against the porch railing beside him, scarf wrapped around her neck, a slight smile curving her lips. "You built them a kingdom," she said softly. Elias shook his head, a rueful smile tugging at his mouth. "They built me one," he replied. The truth settled between them, gentle and undeniable. Inside, the fire crackled in the stove, filling the house with a golden light that danced across the patched walls and newly sanded floors. The battered armchair had been reupholstered by Mrs. Abernathy herself, its faded stuffing replaced, its arms now sturdy and welcoming. The dining table, once a rickety thing listing to one side, stood proudly beneath a handmade quilted runner, a gift from the town's quilting circle. The world was still imperfect. There were nights Elias woke from tangled dreams, heart pounding, fearing he would find the house empty again. There were days when Sparrow limped slightly, a lingering reminder of old injuries, and Ash's smaller frame reminded him how close they had come to being lost. But there was also laughter now, and late mornings spent tangled on the living room rug with two wriggling balls of fur, and dinners shared with Harper at the kitchen table, where once there had been only silence. Millstone, too, seemed to breathe a little easier, as if Elias's small victory had lit a fire in the hearts of others. Mrs. Abernathy started offering free quilting classes at the town hall. Mr. Henley stocked a new line of pet supplies in his store, smiling gruffly whenever anyone mentioned it. Pastor Reynolds organized a donation drive to support abandoned animals, citing the good done by a man with nothing but heart. In every corner, small kindnesses bloomed like stubborn spring flowers pushing through the winter frost. One night, just before Christmas, Harper brought over a battered box wrapped in faded red paper. Inside were two leather collars, each hand-stitched with the puppies' names in careful lettering, and a simple wooden sign that read, "Welcome Home." Elias hung the sign above the door without hesitation. He didn't need a mansion or riches or fame. He didn't need the world's approval. He had a house full of firelight. He had two little souls who trusted him without reservation. He had a friend who saw him, truly saw him, and stayed anyway. And for Elias Quinn, that was more than enough. Sometimes the smallest lives are the ones that reveal the greatest miracles. In a forgotten corner of the world, a broken man, two abandoned puppies, and a town that almost gave up on hope found each other and built something that no storm could destroy. It was not power or wealth that saved them. It was love. It was kindness. It was the quiet belief that no soul, no matter how small or broken, is ever truly forgotten by God. When we choose to open our hearts to the vulnerable, when we stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves, we become part of something far greater than our own fears and failures. We become the hands through which miracles are written into the world. Perhaps it is not in the grand moments, but in the quiet acts of mercy that God's light shines the brightest. And maybe, just maybe, He smiles when we choose love over fear, even when no one else is watching. If you believe there is still goodness in this world, if you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can be a spark of God's miracle, please share this story. Leave a comment below to encourage others. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories of hope, courage, and redemption. And if this touched your heart, write Amen in the comments. May God bless you, and may He always guide your heart to see the miracles hidden in everyday life.